Hello everyone who is joining us on the live stream. Hey. Okay, I'm going to share my screen so you can see a stopwatch. And okay, so if anyone else has a preference as to how your POIs, how you want the other team to request POIs, then you can do so before you start your speech. Um, I think the whole of opposition said that they want their POIs in the chat, so have that in mind, proposition. Okay, let me just share my screen. There, okay. Can you all see this?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So I'm just going to read out the motion. That is always helpful. This House believes that the West should increase its military presence in Ukraine, and unless anybody from the org team has anything else to say, then we can begin the debate, calling Andrea to the podium virtual. Here.
We can start the debate, Maggie.
Great. In a second. There. So I'll start my speech. I'll put my please verbal POIs. I won't be reading the chat. And I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. It is because we want to preserve Ukraine, and it is because we want to save most lives, and which I'll further explain throughout my case, is why, as team proposition, we believe that this house believes that the West should increase its military presence in Ukraine. So with that being said, throughout my speech, I'll be doing first the framework for this debate, because that is super important. In order for us to have a clear debate, we need to establish what the context is. And with that, I'll be explaining my first argument, that of the Ukraine safety and sovereignty, and I'll be explaining our second argument, that of preventing the spread of Russians' idea. So with that being said, let's further move on to the framework for this debate. So first of all, we want to set out the context of what is going on and what is happening right now. So currently, the two countries are in state of war. The Russo-Ukrainian war began in 2014 following the Russian annexation to Crimea from Ukraine. The Russian government feared that Ukraine's membership of the EU and NATO would complete a Western wall of allied countries by restricting Russia's access to the Black Sea. So what does our world look like? In our world, the West sends military aid to Ukraine, fulfilling its promises. Then either the Russian invaders are scared of because of the growing military presence of the West in Ukraine, cutting a catastrophic invasion. Cutting a catastrophic invasion, or they still continue an invasion, but are still deterred by the West military. The results in Ukraine remaining sovereign and relatively safe are strengthening its ties with the West. And what does their world look like? The West does not present a military in Ukraine, essentially allowing Russia to invade them, taking Ukraine and demonstrating that the West will not defend Ukraine. So the economic sanctions that have already been employed only harm Europe, as Russia has a resilient economy. But Europe depends on Russia's natural gas. Russia continues to move further into Ukraine, and the West is locked upon purely for not stopping the Russians. So with that being said, I'll further also want to explain what the West looks like. As team proposition, we believe that West is NATO, which are nations such as Belgium, Canada, the United States, Poland, Portugal, United Kingdom, Turkey, between other nations. And we also want to explain and propose this mechanism, which is the West will increase the military to fend off the Russian invasion, but will attempt to prevent the actual armed conflict if possible, and only do so if defensive forms afterwards. The West will attempt to diplomatically settle the conflict to attack the root cause. So with that being said, let's further move on to our first argument, that of the Ukraine safety and sovereignty. So the point in this argument is that by stopping an invasion from counting, the West saves Ukraine from being held down to a regime that does not care about it. Now, First of all, we want to explain that, okay, so in here we want to explain who benefits Ukraine the most. So basically, on their side they talk, on their side they talk about the possible third world war. However, they do not take it. However, well, so what we need to on this argument, so what we mean on this argument is that they are already getting bombed. So Ukraine's safety and sovereignty is already being into great detriment, is already being into a huge issue. So it is important to note in here that Ukraine would be having their own Ukraine would be having their own interests saved by being protected by the West, as the West also have their interests to protect them. It's not just this Russian huge control over Europe, but also the West has the incentives to protect them. It would be having a stronger relationship with the West, having more financial support from the Western economics. It's not just being regimed by Russia and having this invasion. Also, the ideas will be protected, and people would also be protected. This will be further addressed throughout our second argument, but I'll just speak slightly about this. So what we mean by this is the fact that people would be protected, as they would have this military there would be this military intervention. Now, what if the West did not intervene? What would happen is even worse. People are already going out of the cities. Why? Because of this terror that Russia is already causing. So people are already being scared, and people's safety is already being damaged. Why? Because Russia has these whole arms and they're just intervening now. While we have the West intervening, we have a stopper in there, which would also be protecting the people as well as the country. So now let's move on to what our second point on the same argument is about the long-term security. Now, Ukraine's independence could be defended far more effectively by reaching a diplomatic agreement. So basically, on the point in this argument is that by having the West intervene, there would be having a better long-term effect, as on our side of the house, there were only the extremist way to solve the issue is by using by using the military force by the West. If this does not happen, then the war would be longer, and there would be greater negative effects, not only by killing people, but also the territory expansion of Russia, which would be further detriment. So with that being said, I'll further and quickly move on to our second argument, that of preventing the spreads of Russian ideas. So the point in this argument that is that if Russia enforces the ideology, not only will affect Ukraine, as these ideals are harmful and placed forcefully, but the West, particularly NATO, as I explained in our characterization, particularly NATO, Ukraine borders several NATO states, and the presence of Russia, the primary enemy of NATO, adjacent to them, is something that will mostly raise tensions. Not only that, but the U.S. wants to stop the enforcement. The enforcement and spread of the ideas of Russia, as they are directly opposed to their own. The Russians are enforcing their ideas on Ukraine by force. They are hurting the Ukrainian government, which was switching over to favor NATO. The Ukrainian government was becoming a NATO ally, and Russia did not like this. Therefore, they invaded. These ideals, as well as their form enforcement, are harmful to Ukraine, stated by them, as well as them being incompatible with their own. So the point in this argument and the impact of this argument is that we're actually preventing these people whose ideals are being forced harmfully, and we're also preventing this violent attack by using the West as a protector, because if the West did not intervene, then Ukraine would only be part of Russia, and not only there would be economic detriments, but also there would be ideological detriments, such as we'll explain on our second argument. So with everything that I have explained so far, judges, I've explained to you why on our side of the house, having the presence of the West and having a military presence in Ukraine would be for the best benefit for Ukraine and also for the West, and also for the West. That is why, judges, you should vote for team proposition, because we are ensuring the Ukraine safety and sovereignty, and we are also preventing the spread of Russian ideals. Thank you.
We thank the speaker for her eloquent remarks and would now like to call Facundo to the virtual podium. Here.
Thanks. Can you all hear me well?
Yes.
That's okay. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The first thing we want to mention is that the Proposition House haven't explained at a more depth and what are some of the key terms that they have used in order to explain their points. I think it's important to explain these key terms and define them in order to anybody to understand better this debate. For example, NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that is an international alliance of countries in Europe and North America, established in 1949 with the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty. About economic sanction, we have to have in mind that today all countries depend on foreign trade. Since there's such large dependency, it can be said that if this were not the case, the country would be harmed. Then when a group of countries agree not to buy or to cancel relations with a common country, it loses power indirectly. It may sound like a simple punishment, but it goes much further due to international dependence and foreign trade of a country, as mentioned before. An invasion is when an external agent enters to a country to please for the chat, and I do not accept since I'm explaining. When an external agent enters a country to seize power in a sudden and aggressive manner, but surprise or not, is defined as an invasion. And we have to have the context that NATO wanted to expand to the east, an action that was quickly denied by Russia due to the geographical and geopolitical. This was taken as a threat, and throughout the month, an invasion of land that goes beyond the expansion of NATO, recover Russian soil. On February 24 of this year, Russia invaded Ukraine and arrived in the capital the same day. This saved in all civilians and the army itself, so it was a quick, well-structured and well-done plan. So we want to establish a better burden of proof because we don't have to only think about the Ukraine point of view here. It's an international conflict. If current is between mainly Russia and Ukraine, it is going to affect all the world. So our burden of proof is that we will win if we demonstrate that not augmenting the presence of the West in Ukraine is going to be better for all the international community, not just for Ukraine, not just for Russia, but in general for everyone. Before I start giving my arguments and the context, I accept the POI.
Yes, are you aware of the fact that Russia provides a large amount of natural gas, meaning that any economic sanction would heavily harm Europe?
Well, yes, of course, but we have to have the sanctions have been against Russia. Russia have not taken like such a strong step against natural gas. The main thing we're seeing is that Europe is like canceling more of the treatments or sponsors, for example, with Russia. So how I said, we have to have in mind all the point of view, not only what it's affecting Ukraine, and Russia is also being affected by these economic sanctions by Europe. So we have to have in mind that today a war is not the same as before. It is correct to say that there are much fewer wars than in ancient times, since everyone knows what they are capable of. The fact of fusion sites is already a death sentence, and today, if humanity wants, we can destroy the entire planet with only nuclear bombs, without even ballistic missiles. What today is military conflict is only limited to what the open is limited to. If they bomb you, the capital, you'll be bombarded. So a nuclear war is like a giant threat for all humanity. And if it happens, we all are going to be affected like, never seen before way. So before exposing my arguments, I want to speak about the Proposition House arguments. The first the first strong argument is about the Ukraine sovereignty and the interest of Russia. And overall, it was an argument about Ukraine's point of view, because sometimes we don't see the other side of the history. We have to have in mind that this conflict between Russia and Ukraine is not something new or something since 2014. The Russia and Ukraine wars have been happening like so many centuries before. It's like an historical conflict between these two countries and cultures. This, of course, every side of this war has an argument to do what it's doing. And we have to have in mind that Ukraine is not like the innocent force that is being invaded. But for example, we can mention the ideological and cultural suppression and ban in some sectors of Ukraine. We also can mention like Ukraine killing or being fought against Russian people. For I say this cultural ban of Ukraine about Russian speaking or in general Russian culture talks much about how none of the sides of this spectrum is just innocent or just is like we have to defend Ukraine because it's being invaded. We have to see both sides of this. The second is like the people protected. They say they are going to kill people. Well, in every war, people is going to be killed since it's a war. But we have to have in mind that Russian people have also been killed by Ukrainian people before the invasion. And Russia has treated to do diplomatic advancements, but they never function, and that's why they are taking these parts. So we have to also have in mind that not even in Ukraine, everyone is supporting the country, because we can mention, for example, the independent republics that are supporting the Russian invasion, because it's not only that Ukraine is alone, and so, but we have to have in mind also the whole context. Our first argument is that involving NATO in a war between only two countries till today, which is Russia and Ukraine, with some political support, but it's not like they are directly attacking Ukraine and Russia, would re-escalate the war into something worse, like, for example, a third world war. So if we want to make peace and to actually just focus on this, we have to have in mind the influence of sending troops to other countries. It's not only the fact that you send like people, it's all the influence. And you can ask yourself, why are the troops? Do you think Russia is a threat? Every country is going to protect their sovereignty, but if we actually involve NATO and the troops directly in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, we are directly involving countries like, for example, the United States, Germany, or other Western countries, to be attacking against Russia. And that can re-escalate into a world war. And we have to know that in this event, this whole process is capable of disturbing the global peace on a tremendously big scale. If we have in mind that the war between only two countries can actually harm too much the global situation, imagine what will happen in a world war. What we actually need to know is that in a conflict between just two countries, like it's Russia and Ukraine, it's not necessary to include more and more countries, because that would actually makes the conflict even worse and creating a world war with the context that we have, like, and with the atomic and nuclear potential of both Russia, United States, and other countries in both sides. They would provoke actually a worst case scenario for the world itself. Who I say we don't have to actually just focusing on what is happening in Ukraine and only the views in Ukraine, but actually the whole context as a whole. That's my argument. Thanks.
We thank the speaker for his eloquent remarks and would now like to call Noboru to the virtual podium. Here.
Yo, what's good? ¿Se me oye bien? Can you guys hear me? A ver, what's happening in the Discord? Doesn't matter. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Judges, debaters, people watching this debate in general. Let me paint you a picture. Fire raining down from the sky, artillery hitting the city, missiles raining down and hitting apartments, children running in fear, parents looking for those children because they do not know where they are, people trembling and hiding away in fear in the subway, and essentially what they are telling you is they want to do nothing, which is why we are proud to propose. So during my speech, firstly, I'll be providing firstly, I'll be clarifying strategy a little bit, clarifying the team lines, and then I'll be providing actually one point of clash that we've had, which is essentially what is best for the world, I think is what we've had until now. And then I'll be providing my third argument, that of respect. So firstly, strategically, let's analyze the stakeholders in play, and let's analyze the motion. So essentially, on their side, I don't think they're properly understanding what the motion entails, primarily because one of their refutations to arguments, and this is going to come up later, is that Ukrainians are not necessarily the best people, and they've also killed others. So essentially, they're taking kind of a principled moral stance. However, we tell you that really war doesn't have a good or a bad person in it. It's not about the morality. There's an invader and there is an invaded, sure, but that's not really where it lies. Rather, we believe that this motion focuses on what would the West do, what is in the best interest of the West, and then by connection, because Ukraine is pointed to West, or it's the West, and because the West has shown its expression, it has expressed its discontent with the invasion, and it has expressed its support for Ukraine. Intrinsically, we think that this also entails what is best for Ukraine. So we think that these are the two main stakeholders, but focusing on their case, we think that another big stakeholder that has shown up is the world, right? Beyond that, we'd like to clarify that our mechanism, which I believe they ignored, but our mechanism once more entailed that we would be sending troops. However, the West, when sending, well, the West would send troops. However, they would try to avoid a massive armed conflict at all costs. But if necessary, they would. And once they are fended off, the invaders are fended off, they would try to settle it diplomatically, right? Now, moving on to the point of clash, which is what is better for the world. So on their side, they tell you that there is going to be this possible world war, which, firstly, we don't understand how that's mechanized. I mean, they just say another country comes in, so there's going to be a world war. I mean, we've had examples of multilateral wars in other places, like, I don't know, Afghanistan, Libya. It hasn't really resulted into this giant world war, and they don't explain how this war in particular would cause a world war. Sorry, I'm a little bit sick right now, but anyways, they don't explain that. They just expect us to believe it, which we don't. But even if it did happen, right? Even if there were a world war, there already is a war, right? And they tell you that this lies the second another country comes in. But what they're forgetting is that in this scenario, which is our current world scenario, as we already explained, the West is already involved, and they did propose the West getting involved. Like the West getting involved in any way at all is not exclusive to any side. On their side, they're just saying that they're going to do it via economic sanctions. But on both sides, the West is going to get involved. So either way, there's going to be a sort of global conflict. So in the end, the question is, firstly, they don't tell us why there's going to be a world war, but even if there were, even if we took them at their highest case, which is where there is a world war, and that lies only if the West comes in with the military, because they're already involved. So who's to say that economic sanctions won't also launch this conflict, which happens on your side as well. But even if it were exclusive to our side, right, and only on our side that we already have this giant world war thing, it's not guaranteed that it'll happen. So the question is, what's better? An invasion that's already going on and that is already harming people, that is already putting tension on NATO, or this possible world war? We tell you that it's much more dangerous to have this guaranteed invasion continue, which is going to give Russia enough, a lot of power over time, and more than power, it's going to increase tensions and possibly even result in this big conflict, regardless of whether the West intervenes right now with the military, right? Because we tell you that the second that they put tensions in NATO is the second that we enter even more unprecedented times in history, and that's the second that we put ourselves at even more risk of this whole World War III, right? On our side of what's better for the world, we tell you that we're preventing the dangerous spread of Russian ideals, and we're preventing them from getting enough power to turn it into a multipolar world. We tell you that it is more beneficial for Ukraine because, firstly, Ukraine is part of the world, but we tell you that it is more beneficial for Ukraine because it's not getting ideals enforced on it, it's not getting hurt, it's not getting, invaded. And the problem is, if you didn't know, yesterday, I believe, President Vladimir Putin told the nuclear deterrent forces to establish some sort of a new strange regime, which means that he's probably preparing to receive or maybe even give out nuclear attacks, which means that we are already in danger. But how does this change with our side? Right, we tell you that when we intervene, we're showing Putin that the West is showing Putin that they're not scared. They're showing Putin that he cannot invade and take Ukraine, and just in principle, this is better and this is more coherent with the West's values. We also tell you that we prevent this invasion from continuing, which we believe is much more beneficial. Now, moving on to my third argument, that of respect. So, the more Russia gains power, because Ukraine is a huge country, like half the population of Germany, and it's the top, it's the fourth, it's one of the top 4 grain exporters in the world, which is cool. Anyways, by not going there and defending Ukraine, the West is showing that it will not defend them. This establishes the precedent that Russia can do whatever they want, and it provides them with the power to project their political influence further, and it takes away NATO's power in the Russian area. The result of this is the West is looked harshly upon because, well, they didn't defend themselves. B, the West loses geopolitical power, which is bad. And C, this allows Russia to essentially just keep taking and taking and taking. And why is this different with their economic sanctions? We tell you that economic sanctions have not and will not work because Russia's economy is surprisingly resilient. They're super rich, but they are one of the top 6 natural gas exporters and provide around 30% of European natural gas, which means that a French family is going to be freezing within a year. It's going to be super expensive to get natural gas. So in general, what we tell you is that it's in the best interest of the West to do to support our side, because they won't lose geopolitical power, because they won't be establishing a precedent that Russia can do whatever they want. They won't suffer these economic detriments more than Russia. Also, they won't suffer these economic detriments because they are receiving economic harm already. It's already more expensive to buy gas because Russia has already cut off their supply. We tell you that they won't allow Russia to go unpunished. We tell you that it's better for Ukraine because they don't get invaded anymore. And we tell you that it's better for the world because we get to maintain a global peace. Thank you.
We thank the speaker for his eloquent remarks and would now like to call Mauricio to the virtual podium. Here.
Okay, thanks. Good morning to everyone. First, I want to clarify some points that the proposition team made that weren't too much clear and had some fragilities. Okay, first, the second speaker of proposition at the start just tried to use sentimentalism without any logical reasoning by telling us to imagine the Ukrainian invasion, how the Ukrainian environment is just destruction, fire, planes deploying bombs. But then he contradicted himself by saying that the war lacked morality and ethics. Thus, it is totally invalidated. And after that, he said that the mechanism has been ignored by us. But we aren't ignoring it. We are just confronting it because it is totally biased. When your mechanism says that the West is going to avoid any conflict, it can be logically proved that the West is going to successfully stop this big incoming conflict if they take some actions. And it can be even more weakened thanks to the quotes of Putin, who claims that if the West intervenes into the invasion, it is going to see consequences never seen in their history. Thus, it is not possible to send military reinforcement and avoiding any type of further conflict. Then I'm going to say my second argument, that is the possible economic consequences. We currently live in an interconnected world. Hence, our economies are now more dependent on the rest of the globe than ever. For those reasons, the military intervention will affect everyone on a larger scale. If the West sends troops, it automatically will elevate the scale of the conflict. Even if you are against that, I mean, the West can send troops and it will immediately involve any country of NATO on it because they are defending it. And Russia already told us, yes, that it is going to severely damage the West and involve in a further conflict indirectly if they intervene. So, after mentioning the military consequences that it might have, now we want to talk about the economic aspect. It is clear that nowadays we live into an interconnected society. No country is totally self-dependent in terms of services and goods. If a bigger war is started, a lot of countries will lose economic stability because the West depends a lot of aspects in Russia and its allies. As the first speaker of the proposition team said, and then the second speaker also used it as a point. Europe depends mostly on Russian gas. Therefore, if they intervene in the conflict, thanks to the threats of Putin, it will obviously transform into a resource war. Why? Because Russia can easily stop the commercial deals they already have with the NATO countries, stopping the benefits that they get, and also their gas supply, because if they can stop it, and even the price of the gas will inflate and will not have any type of hesitation on doing it. For these reasons, we can conclude that the military intervention in Ukraine will trigger Russia's threats and start giving economic sanctions to the West. Therefore, the break of international treatments would severely damage the global economy. Oh, and also about the point, well, I'll ask for it later, and start giving economic sanctions to the West. Therefore, the break of international treatments will severely damage the global economy if the war scales even more. Not only Ukrainian or Russian people, but the whole world is going to economically perish if a conflict of the magnitude mentioned takes place. Not only damaging Ukrainian people, all the world might suffer these economic sanctions, probably not getting access to certain products or services from the opposite side, because also NATO, the economy of NATO has inside the most economic powers on their hands, and also a lot of supply and resources that they give and trade with all the countries, and even with Russia, the economic sanctions, even with Russia, and also panel, and also the conflict. Yes, sorry, the conflict will damage currencies, of course, the currency values and the stock market. Panel, it is worth to intervene in this conflict, knowing that it might lead to consequences for all the NATO countries and their population, that they are innocent and they do not intervene in these decisions. It is NATO's duty to protect their economic safety of the people living in their countries, meaning that intervening is going to damage more than 2 billion people. Furthermore, the global economy has already been totally damaged by the pandemic. It is not factible to start a conflict of this magnitude with a power like Russia if we are trying to get out of this pandemic. And okay, I'll answer the point.
Isn't it also NATO's duty to protect a NATO ally from Russia and to prevent Russia from spreading their ideals and putting tensions on NATO countries adjacent to Russia?
Well, actually, yes, but let's put it clear. Ukraine is not part of NATO yet. A lot of NATO countries have denied its entrance thanks to this. So it is not NATO's duty to protect actually Ukraine. And as Putin said, if they attack Ukraine, he's going to make the West suffer with consequences never seen in history. So he's basically threatening NATO countries and their people. So it is NATO's duty also not to intervene, because following Putin's threats, if they directly intervene, they are going to see the consequences, and basically they are sacrificing intervention in another country with the possible threat of war to the NATO countries, and then NATO will be then its duty will be to start attacking Russia, leading into a larger conflict. So basically, that's the point. Then, so to conclude, the economic sanctions are actually going to damage all the people living in the world, not only Ukrainian and Russian people, and also it might difficult the Ukrainian Ukrainians' lives if they are trying to travel to another country because to protect themselves. And they will have it harder if the economies are currently being crushed, and they will not get enough opportunities of trying to escalate the economic pyramid again and get a decent life in another country if the economies are, if the economies are damaged and all the currency value is less, so they will have it harder. So even the Ukrainian people will suffer terribly from these consequences. Thanks.
We thank the speaker for his eloquent remarks and would now like to call Lucia to the virtual podium. Here.
Here, and my time starts in 3, 2, 1. Okay. Judges, people in Ukraine right now live in constant fear of getting attacked or robbed or bombed any second by Russian troops. Children have stopped going to schools. Adults can't go to work, and the old are just getting deja vu. All of these people now, in order to be as safe as possible during nights, have to go to sleep to the subway. With all these fear inflicted, because there are other things people have to do in order to feel safe, many have fled, etc. With all of this fear inflicted, what has Putin achieved through this? Control. In general, what has Russia achieved from this? Control over Ukraine. So I will be further talking about that point, about Russia doing whatever they want, or more like Putin, because we have seen that the Russians are not really in favor of this war. First of all, our first point of clash is who benefits Ukraine the most. On our side, they talk about the possible Third World War. They, however, do not take into account that this conflict is escalating naturally. Right now, it could start or tomorrow, or maybe in 1 minute. Like, it's just, that's how it keeps going, and we need to do something to prevent this. With increasing tensions as Russia moves into Ukraine, the conflict will keep on escalating. However, even if this weren't true, Russia's invasion, or more like Putin's invasion, would already be. Oh, by the way, I didn't state my point, my POIs. If someone has one, please interrupt me. I'm not checking the chat.
Okay, I would like to ask you a point of information.
Yes.
Okay. Which proofs do you have that the conflict is going to escalate naturally? And how can you measure the time of it?
We do not know how this conflict is escalating. All we know is that this conflict is escalating really quickly, and we are not doing anything to stop it, apparently, except small things like economic sanctions, which is, like you guys said, like your side opposition said, affecting the whole world. In fact, we as proposition want to prevent all of these economic sanctions to mark economically the world permanently. I'll be further talking about that in my arguments. Well, not arguments, in my replies and my points of clash. Anyway, I was saying, they put this tension in NATO and countries raising all over tensions, risking further war. However, even if this weren't true, Russia's invasion would already be devastating, and bigger conflict would not be much worse. On our side, we defend Ukraine's sovereignty. We stop Russia from stomping all over that, basically. And so, to which side benefits the West the most? They talk about these economic damages in Europe, but they proposed economic sanctions. Russia has already cut off Europe's supply of natural gas. So this economic damage already has happened. On our side, even if these sanctions also exist, which is not well explained, and it's not likely because NATO corners Russia, most likely they will twist it and arm it to lift in them. And at least Russia doesn't get away hurting Ukraine and the world peace. We tell you that when there is no intervention on their side, Russia gains power and leverage, as well as good strategic position to attack NATO countries. And we tell you that the principal role of NATO is to maintain the world's peace, yet it will not be fulfilling its job if it just sits around and does absolutely nothing. And which I will be actually talking about this in one of my fellow mates' speech. And so, first of all, I want to remind that our first speaker mentions how Russia takes Ukraine with no problem, and the West shows they don't care about Ukraine, and how Ukraine is falling to a regime that does not really care about them. That we know that there are many different reasons why Putin wants to interfere Ukraine, either because again of the natural gas, either because he has this idea of Russia in his childhood and Ukraine being part of it, and he wants to bring that back, or it's even these ideals, which even as it doesn't seem important, as it doesn't look that important, it is how Russia wants this territory to also expand ideals such as communism, which goes against all of the values that Ukraine believes in. Why? Because Ukraine has this kind of thinking, this similarity of thinking more to the West countries about like democracy and other different values that they that are more similar than they are to the Western than they are to Russia. Then not only that, but NATO has already expressed its disapproval of the invasion. Therefore, the world has to become to defend it. Again, why is this important? Because all of these allies of NATO, they have all they created NATO in order to keep peace, in order to know that the countries that are there are allies, and that the countries that are there will protect each other in case of things like this. So if NATO shows they do not care about the allies they have, such as Ukraine, all of these countries, what will all of these countries think of? Maybe if I get invaded, what will they do anyway? They won't really do anything. So they might search even other allies as the other countries to ally with, because they have seen that NATO does absolutely nothing. NATO just sits around and see what will happen. They do nothing. This is not the message we want to deliver. We want to deliver that NATO will protect these countries if they need them. That NATO will not just sit around while all of these Ukrainian people are suffering, while many are dying and are just, the whole country is being invaded and probably is going to be annexed to Russia if we don't do anything right now. The first opposition speaker says that the way the world looks right now is the way that it has always been, because there has always been a conflict since, I think they said 2014, about Russia and Ukraine. But the thing is, no, it's not the same, because this has been the most serious attack since World War II. And like we have mentioned many and several times, this conflict just keeps escalating. So what have proposition proved to you, judges? We have proved that yes, war, opposition keeps saying we want to prevent war, but what they fail to realize in this debate is that war is already happening. And what does proposition tell you? Proposition is telling you that we want to prevent this conflict to become even bigger, that we want to take action right now to what is going on. We don't want to sit around and do nothing. And we are here to also admit and realize that the real stakeholder here, besides the world, is mainly Ukraine, and we want to find a way to help these people right now. We want to, if it is interfering with military troops is what it takes to save lives, we are willing to take the risk. Thank you.
We thank the speaker for her eloquent remarks and would now like to call Nicolas to the virtual podium. Here.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Is my
Yes.
mic?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like the poise in the chat, please. And my speech is going to start in 3, 2, 1. Okay. Proposition third speaker and all you're mentioning are consequences of a war. Is this better than making Ukraine a battlefield? You have accepted that they don't have no way to prove it because they cannot, as I will say later, you cannot prove that this conflict is escalating. Then we are not talking about of a third world war. Regardless, if this happens, we are talking about the fact that of having impact specifically in Ukraine, because the West is having a lot of impact really, both in the Baltic countries and in Poland. Then we have to clarify that Ukraine is not apart from NATO, and I would like to specify a certain point. This sanction is very strong due to the fact that Russia will lose billions of dollars in frozen stock. I'm going to quote a phrase from Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission. All these measurements will significantly damage Putin's ability to finance his war. All we are doing is stopping this conflict in an indirect and less bloody way. All countries agree that, and world leaders are saying, politicians and diplomatics, including the most active military ones, like even Donald Trump, has agreed on the same thing. Do not have a direct presence to avoid a major conflict. Then about your argument of European trade, that this is going like as all this is going, the most affected by this conflict is Russia at the end. Russia represents the supply of European gas and oil. That's a fact, we can't deny it. But this argument is really irrelevant because there always will be buyers. There are the United States, there is the Arab countries. A country in this era is impossible to run out of resources because trade and trade is always going to be present. At the end, the country that will be the most affected is the country that export this gas. In this case is Russia. If we start thinking about it, Russia is going to be the most affected by not being able to sell this stock. More than its 60% of gas and oil exported. 60% of gas and oil from Russia is exported. Now, who is going to buy all that oil if it's not Europeans? At the end, the most affected will be Russia, right? Without buyers, it will only devalue itself every time more. Like it will only devalue until they get poor. Then you said in your first speech, with that said, the two countries are at war. It began in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. Okay. The conflict, because these two countries, Russia and Ukraine, began where Ukraine showed heirs of joining NATO. It didn't started with Crimea. Then you said they let Russia invade them. You are mentioning that the countries supported economically, that the countries that supported economically and cutting relations with Russia are not doing anything about it. Like you are mentioning an unrealistic scenario where no country does nothing about anything and really didn't even like what you're saying is that none country has had a impact on Ukraine. Okay, that's fake because they literally have put sanctions and as I'm going to explain later. Then defending the invasion, the West would save Ukraine. You said this in your second speech. This will cause completely the opposite thing because an international conflict would be created, which already exists. Like there is a conflict, we can deny it, but it does not reach the level of a world war. Then in your second speech, you said you committed the same mistake as before because they have this impact. Then you said the Ukrainians are not the best people. What do you mean with this? The Ukrainians have defended the capital as the best they could, but the Russians had mercy at the end. Ukraine could have become a world battlefield, but it was not. The war will end soon. Russia technically has lost the war. Then you contradict yourself because the conflicts you mentioned in Afghanistan did not have an impact that compromise the entire planet integrity or the entire planet's economy. Like the conflict in Afghanistan started because of a completely different reasons, and the OTAN, the NATO, was completely involved in this. I'm gonna
Wayne?
take that point. Yeah.
Yes. And how are you sure that the Ukrainian conflict will involve the entire world and will compromise this entire world war thing?
That's what you couldn't explain. I'm talking about how this won't compromise every country integrity, because at the end they are not having the military impact that I'm going to explain later. Okay, the reason why there would be a third world war is because of Vladimir Putin's testimonies and threats, the most serious consequence seen in history. I think that's a nuke threat. I'm not gonna lie, is pretty, if you start thinking about it, what else can be the most serious consequences in history? Then, which is better for the world? A war starts when countries from all continents, a world war starts where countries from all continents are related to this conflict. But we have to clarify something. Human resources are not the same as imposing sanctions or economic help, because when, for example, when Germany gave weapons to Ukraine, Germany did not know related to this conflict, because no Germans set foot in Ukrainian soil. The fact that they have human resources, the fact that there would be Americans destined to die to defend a soil that does not belong to them, creates a relationship of alliance. And that would start a world war because of deaths of other peoples from people from other countries that die literally in other countries' soil to protect their integrity. Then Russia did not give any indication of continue. You said that Russia won't stop, as they saw in the West did nothing. Well, that's fake. A greater conflict will be made. Well, that's a lie also, because this war is over. They made threats, and we all threats, and like technically this is the most peaceful day of the war. We all know what Russia is capable to do. Rather, Russia is showing signals of peace. The president spoke yesterday, but apparently this house is not very up to the date. Exactly an hour ago, in Peruvian time, Russia and Ukraine agreed to talk in Belarus. The war is over technically. Everything they mentioned does not agree with reality. Sentimentalism is what you're using, then you're blind by all the respect that countries should impose without seeing the consequences that they can cause. War is over. The treaties are not being made in Belarus. History is what defines what happens or not. Thank you.
We thank the speaker for his eloquent remarks and would now like to call Facundo to the virtual podium to deliver the reply speech of the opposition team. Here.
Can you hear me well?
Yes, I can hear you.
That's nice. I'll start my reply in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to express the points of clash in this debate and then say what opposition would have to win this debate. The first one I label as just Ukraine versus the world as a whole. It's not that the world as a whole is invading Ukraine, but the fact that they actually just took the point of Ukraine and how it's going to be affected. And they actually make a terrible mistake, because when focusing only in a country or a block of countries, they actually ignored how Ukraine is going to be more affected by their own measures. They said first one that the mechanism is sending troops while avoiding a massive conflict, which is pretty hard, since we have to have in mind that if you actually involve more countries in a conflict, they are probably going to get involved in like a greater war. But they say a sentimentalistic thing about how Ukraine people is being damaged by this conflict. But what they don't know is that they actually put troops of NATO in Ukraine. What they are going to create is a massive battlefield between two of the most powerful parts of the world, which are Russia and the USA. The actual mechanism or sending troops to Ukraine is actually going to make a war that is going to make the sentimentalist argument, like they say, and people dying, like nothing in comparison to what can happen to Ukraine if they convert the country in a battlefield between NATO and Russia. The second one is that the World War, we talked about the possibility or not. They compared the conflict in Afghanistan, which it was like, okay, it was important, but it's not just as much as the actual conflict between Russia and Ukraine, because they actually want to involve NATO, which is a set of countries that involve Europe and the United States, versus Russia, which could have the political and military approve and support of China. So you can compare the conflict in Afghanistan to the actual conflict. The third one is one of the most important, is the pro-West view versus a global view. They actually only talked about the benefits of the West on Ukraine, ignoring the fact that it can also affect Russia and other parts of the world. It's not bad to defend Ukraine or the West. What is bad is to only focus solely on the point of how is this going to benefit Ukraine or the West. That's why our burden of proof is that if we can actually prove that the whole world is going to be more harmed than affected by their measures, we are going to win. And that's what we are proving. So they also talked about communism versus democracy. But first, I want to establish two things. Like communism or any ideology doesn't mean like the suppression of democracy. And also Putin, he literally said some years ago that Russia is not a communist state and will not actually be communist, because the system already didn't work that well in the USSR. Russia is not just communism. We want to like share the whole view of communism. That's an outdated idea that actually just shows that they are not informed about Russia. They are only informed in the way they want to be informed, just to only support like half of the whole part, because a war is involving like two blocks, NATO and Ukraine, and Russia and the other bloc with China and so on. Proposition wants to prevent a war sending troops with the promise of liberty, the same promise which doomed many other countries, for example, Afghanistan or Iraq, Syria. In those conflicts, like Russia didn't make that much of like a conflict or menace, but when Russia invades Ukraine with solid arguments and with actually support of part of the promises on Ukraine, now they want to liberate it or make it liberally. The only thing they want to make is Ukraine like a battlefield, and that's why we won. Their measures are going to affect and harm these people more than they are going to be benefit. That's why we won. Thank you.
We thank the speaker for his eloquent remarks and would finally like to call Noboru to the virtual podium in order to deliver the proposition reply speech and the last speech of the debate. Here.
Yes. Before I start, y'all, dope debate. I love the energy, and I'm really excited for us to be done. Also, not be done. Like, well, you know what I mean. Anyways, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, people watching this debate. See, here's the problem. On their side, they've got not only rather a confusing case, but they've got a case that defends NATO ignoring its duty to protect global peace, and they are saying that they are somehow best fulfilling it, and we're very confused, honestly. Proud to propose. Now, during my speech, firstly, I'll be providing sort of a strategic clarification, as I did in my first speech. I think that really helped me, and I'll move on to boiling down the debate into two main questions. Number one, who best fulfills the role of NATO? And in that sense, best benefits the West. And number two, who helps Ukraine the most? Okay. Now moving on to my strategic clarification. So throughout this debate, we had basically the three stakeholders I mentioned in my speech, right? So we had the world, we've had the West, and we've had Ukraine. However, I think that another one has risen, which is morality. I think morality has been something that's been very present throughout this debate. Now, let's discuss both teams' team lines, right? So on our side, our team line has been pretty smooth. We tell you, oh, invasions are bad. We stop an invasion. We stop something bad. We don't let Russia stumble over Ukraine. We protect world peace. And we stop them from putting tensions on NATO countries and from taking away geopolitical power from NATO. On their side, I would say personally, it's a lot more confusing, right? For example, the third speaker says that this war wouldn't ripple out into many countries, but then their entire thing is it's gonna lead into a world war. And then they say that it's not NATO's duty to protect them, but then they say that they would give economic sanctions. They say that they want to protect the economy, but then they give economic sanctions. For me, it's rather confusing what they're trying to say. And I would just like to say that they at the end, they brought in a point that I will sadly not be able to discuss, which is there's been a strategic clash, right? Which is we're debating in a setting where the war is still going on. I think we made that pretty clear. I think that was where the debate was centered for the first 5 speeches. However, on the 6th speech, on their 3rd speech, they come up here and they tell you, well, the war's already over, so nothing you said makes any sense at all. We think this is kind of truistic, and I find it rather sneaky because I can't say anything to it. I'm a reply speaker. I can't add any rebuttals, but I'd just like to say we don't think this is very relevant to the debate because that's not how we've been debating. If they had brought it up at the beginning, then maybe, but okay. So now moving on to my 2 main questions. So number 1, who best fulfills the role of NATO, right? We tell you that NATO's role has essentially been shifted, as my 3rd speaker said. We tell you that even if it wasn't NATO's role to protect Ukraine at any point, we tell you that number 1, we told you Ukraine doesn't have to be a part of NATO because it's NATO allied, right? It is an ally of NATO. But not only that, NATO has condemned the invasion and has basically sworn to protect Ukraine. Therefore, their role has changed. Not only that, but as they said, it's their role to protect their economies. However, even economic sanctions have resulted in the supply of oil being cut off. So these economic detriments are already happening, right? We tell you that at least on our side, Russia doesn't get to do whatever they want. Now, moving on to my 2nd point of clash, that of Ukraine. We tell you that on our side, Ukraine doesn't get invaded. It doesn't get these ideals pushed on it. We tell you that on our side, they don't get bombed anymore. And then on their side, they tell you there's going to be a huge world war. We can't tell you why, but we know there's going to be one. So trust us. And we tell you, number 1, we don't believe this is going to happen. Number 2, we believe that conflict escalates naturally, as we said as I said on my 2nd speech and my 3rd speaker said, conflict escalates naturally because they put tensions on NATO countries, right? We tell you that we've benefited every stakeholder, and their side is rather contradictory. Thank you.
We thank the speaker for his eloquent remarks, and